Thanks, Eric, and thanks for everybody for coming to the conference. I think it's a really good conference and very well attended. It's my pleasure to introduce our luncheon speaker, Dr. Robert Lifset. I ran across Dr. Lifset last year in Chicago at the American Society for Environmental History Conference. When I wear another hat, I'm a historian, in part an environmental historian. You can read my book on lead and Kellogg, Idaho, if you want. It's called Living with Lead. It came out last year. But enough about me. And one more thing about me, though. I am the board chair, but only for, I'm going to turn into a pumpkin here in just a few hours at the end of the conference. It's been my great pleasure to serve as the board chair of the Wheeler Center for the last 6 years. I'm about to turn that over to the very capable hands of Chuck Tooley, the longtime and great mayor of Billings, Montana, right at the end of this conference. So Robert Lifset is the Donald Keith Jones Associate Professor of History at the University of Oklahoma, where he teaches energy history with a focus on the United States. And I believe that's, if I'm not mistaken, that's one of only 2 endowed energy chairs in history in the country. So he has a great job. Lifset's first book, Power on the Hudson, Storm King Mountain, and the Emergence of Modern American Environmentalism, describes an iconic environmental struggle in New York's Hudson River Valley in the 1960s and 70s. Power on the Hudson was awarded the Herbert H. Lehman Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in New York History by the New York Academy of History in 2016. Lifset recently edited American Energy Policy in the 1970s, a collection of essays that examines the last time energy issues rose to the forefront of the national political discourse. Lifset has also published articles or essays in the Journal of American History, Historical Social Research, Reviews in American History, and the Hudson River Valley Review. He is currently researching and writing a history of the energy crisis of the 1970s. Let's give a warm Montana welcome to Dr. Robert Lifset.
All right, so thank you for inviting me and for staying for lunch to hear the rest of this talk. Okay, so I guess I left things off the panel this morning with this idea that, okay, coal experiences this renaissance in the 70s. So I'm going to follow up and think about why. Why does the United States return to coal? Why did this turn begin in the 70s, a decade often thought of as the high watermark of American environmentalism? Whoops. There we go. The short answer is that the energy crisis produced a set of conditions that made the shift toward coal appear both logical and necessary. A series of price increases engineered by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, beginning in 1971, and an embargo orchestrated by the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, OAPEC, in 1973, made oil both more expensive and increasingly difficult to acquire. President Nixon determined that the nation's reliance on foreign supplies of oil was to blame and initiated a half-hearted gesture toward economic autarky described as energy independence, which has since been unsuccessfully pursued by the 8 presidents that followed him. That's a little facetious. But here you can see this is the price of oil, natural gas, and coal per kilowatt hours. So from the perspective of the electric utility industry, and you can see how oil prices basically go off the charts. If the reliance, why don't you just hit it? If the reliance on foreign oil was the problem, one obvious solution would be to reduce domestic oil consumption. Oil was used for 3 primary purposes in the 1970s. First, then as today, it dominated the energy use in the transportation sector of the economy. Second, it was used by industry as a feedstock for a range of chemical products. And third, it was used to generate electricity. This doesn't exist today, but at the time it did. A solution to the oil crisis then became to replace oil in the production of electricity by looking forward to nuclear power and backward to coal. This was the mantra of the electric utility industry in the early 1970s. The future is we're going to look forward to nuclear power and backward to coal. It's difficult for us today to imagine the enthusiasm that once surrounded nuclear power in America. In 1973, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission estimated that by the year 2000, there would be more than 1,000 nuclear power plants in the United States. Presidents Nixon and Ford both made an expansion of nuclear power a key component of reducing the nation's petroleum consumption. President Ford even announced in his first State of the Union address in 1975 a goal of having 200 nuclear power plants in operation within 10 years. If this had ever come to pass, there would not have been a Western renaissance of coal, by the way. The U.S. never came close to building nuclear power plants in these quantities. There are today 99 nuclear units at 62 plants, producing about 20% of the nation's electricity. As it turned out, the 1970s were a horrible time to build a nuclear power plant. Nuclear power plants require the highest upfront costs in the most capital-intensive industry at a moment when both inflation and interest rates were high and rising. At the same time, there existed a great deal of regulatory uncertainty. Nuclear power plants constructed prior to the mid-1960s were typically small and experimental. Both the industry and their regulators discovered there was a steep learning curve in quickly scaling designs up to the size, and I'm thinking 1 to 2,000 megawatt range, necessary to make the plants economic. As a result, in the 1970s, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was continuously issuing regulations that both slowed down the construction of new plants while making them more expensive. This slide demonstrates how the time it took to construct nuclear power plants really lengthened in the 1970s. Next slide. In the 70s, the electric utility industry was experiencing a crisis related to but separate from the larger energy crisis of that decade. And so it should not come as a surprise, and it was not lost on the industry, that many of the utilities closest to bankruptcy in the 70s were involved in building nuclear power plants whose costs had simply spiraled out of control. Beginning in 1974, 5 years before the 3 Mile Island accident, nuclear power plant orders began to decline. Nuclear power in America would never recover. And so I want to also kind of give you a sense of how unusual this is. We're talking about, this is before deregulation, so these electric utility companies are regulated monopolies. It's supposed to be impossible to go bankrupt if you're a regulated monopoly. You can pass your costs on to your customers. And yet, many utility companies in the United States were teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. This gets reflected in the stock price, and this is shows you how in the late 70s the stock price fell below the book value on average for the private investor-owned utility community. So if by the mid-70s nuclear power would be unavailable to replace oil and natural gas, that left coal. And into this context, the virtues of coal were suddenly rediscovered. The U.S. possessed such vast reserves that it was often referred to as the Persian Gulf of coal. And coal itself was now described as the Great Black Hope. A casual reader of the New York Times learned that coal was used in everything from aspirin to perfume. In addition to being burned in electric power plants, coal could potentially be converted into a synthetic fuel that could also be used for transportation. This was a source of some enthusiasm in the 1970s. The synthetic production of oil from coal was the focus of some enthusiasm. Okay, so coal for a period looked capable of replacing oil. Coal became the new frontier in oil production. Journalists began writing about a détente for coal. Yet coal was not without its problems. This project required a certain optimism about the ability to deal with the effects of returning to coal. If landscapes were damaged due to strip mining, they would simply be reclaimed. If coal produced horrific air pollution, the new technology, such as scrubbers, would be deployed to reduce the worst of it. And it appeared the vehicles to do this work were conveniently at hand in the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977 and the Clean Air Act amendments of 1977. Climate change was recognized as an issue at the time, but largely dismissed. The optimism found expression in the various committees and reports that sought to reconcile increased coal production and consumption with the maintenance of newly established environmental standards. One such effort was the National Coal Policy Project, a year-long series of meetings between environmentalists and mid- and top-level executives at coal mining and coal-consuming industries. In a report released in February of 1978, both sides made concessions agreeing on more than 200 steps that could help the nation shift from oil to coal. This optimism was also expressed by a government-convened committee, which reported that the nation could expand its coal production and consumption without environmental degradation, provided there was strict adherence to existing environmental law. There were environmentalists who described coal as a bridge or transition fuel between the present and a future powered by solar, wind, and geothermal. Even Amory Lovins argued that coal could be considered consistent with his notion of a soft energy technology. So they say going into the past is sometimes like going to a foreign planet. And the further back you go, the more that seems. In this case, there's a bit of truth to that in the sense that this revival of coal in the 70s accompanied an effort not to plow through and undermine environmentalism, but actually to work with environmentalists and to get them on board with the effort. Something that is hard to imagine today. Next slide. The shift toward coal grew more serious when the federal government acquired the power to order electric power plants to convert from oil and gas to coal in the Energy Supply and Environmental Coordination Act of 1974. This bill was originally intended to make substantial changes to the Clean Air Act of 1970. That law, the Clean Air Act, required industrial polluters to meet new state emission control standards by mid-1975 or 77. Companies that burned coal could switch to burning cleaner fuels, such as oil or natural gas, or install emission control equipment, scrubbers. Faced with this choice, many companies chose to switch to burning cleaner fuels. The Energy Supply and Environmental Coordination Act required electric power plants that could burn coal to continue to do so through 1978. And it also authorized the Federal Energy Administration to order conversions to coal. The EPA was to extend compliance with final emission deadlines to 1978. And so at one point, the Ford administration envisioned converting as many as 140 oil-burning plants to coal by 1980. By the spring of 1977, 74 electric power plants had been ordered to switch. None had actually, at that point, done so. It was widely believed at the time that the procedures for ordering the conversion were cumbersome, slow, and ineffective. The Ford administration partially blamed environmentalism and unsuccessfully lobbied to further amend ASECA to limit EPA's authority to suspend FEA conversion orders. When President Carter took office in the winter of 1977, he promised the nation a comprehensive energy policy in 90 days. Now, it's important to note that Carter and his energy czar, depicted here, James Schlesinger, both held deeply pessimistic views on the future of oil and gas. They believed America was running out, and as Schlesinger explained in this 1977 piece in Time magazine, quote, "We have a classic Malthusian case of exponential growth against a finite resource." This, by the way, was widely also shared in the oil industry and the intelligence community. Carter, I think, famously declassified a CIA estimate of future international oil production and consumption that was very gloomy. And this would also explain when Jamie in his earlier talk was describing, Shell and Chevron leasing, subsoil mineral rights or coal rights, right, on tribal land in Montana. These are not energy companies, really. These are oil and gas companies. And oil and gas companies are horizontally integrating into the coal industry, in part because of the pessimism about the future of oil and gas. As a result, for the first time in U.S. history, the administration placed the conservation of demand at the center of U.S. energy policy, and for doing so, they gained a good deal of respect in the environmental community. Environmentalists had long been arguing that consumption and demand were key to understanding both the environmental and the energy crisis. However, this Malthusian perspective did not extend to coal, and so President Carter made the conversion of oil and gas-powered electric plants to coal an important part of his energy policy, probably the most forgotten part of his energy policy. The shift back to coal could also be viewed as an effort to address long-standing regional and economic issues. The decline in coal consumption, coupled with technological changes in the mining of coal, threw 300,000 miners out of work in the 30 years after World War II. Appalachia never fully recovered, as the region suffered a higher than national average unemployment rate and an outmigration of people during the 1950s and 60s. Federal policy also contributed to the problems in the coal industry and the poverty of Appalachia in two ways. First, Whereas natural gas was deemed a public utility and managed by an independent regulatory commission, the Federal Power Commission, and oil production was controlled by state authorities, the coal industry never benefited from a government-sanctioned stabilization effort. And second, the federal government spent billions of dollars on nuclear power research and on building hydroelectric dams, both of which competed for market share in the generation of electricity with coal. The Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson administrations all convened committees to study how to reverse the economic fortunes of Appalachia. Each of these committees asked, would support for the coal industry be an effective way to help the people of Appalachia? Was there a national interest in shoring up the coal industry? And the answer they arrived at was no. And so most of the federal help for Appalachia, at the time and since, has arrived in the form of funding for infrastructure and education. Disadvantaged by the relative disorder within the industry itself, congressional representatives from coal states pushed for increased federal funding for research and development, with most of this money supporting work on synthetic fuels, which turned out to be a dead end. But, this was the golden hope at the time. If it had been successful, it would have allowed coal to substitute for oil in the transportation market. The energy crisis then appeared as a godsend, pushing up oil and natural gas prices and moving pro-consumer, cheap energy advocates like Senator Scoop Jackson, chairman of the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, towards support for federally mandated coal conversion for the nation's electric power plants. The ascension of Senator Robert Byrd, a Democrat from West Virginia, a long-standing advocate of coal interests as Senate Majority Leader in January of 1977, could also be seen as a sign of the industry's rising fortunes. As if to underscore the problems of relying on coal, 160,000 miners belonging to the United Mine Workers walked off the job, cutting in half U.S. production of soft coal in the midst of a brutally cold winter in December of 1977. The strike began upon the expiration of the existing contract between the UMW and the Bituminous Coal Owners Association, but there was growing discontent among the rank and file with the union leadership. John L. Lewis, president of the union from 1920 to 1960, devised a plan to stabilize the industry and improve the working conditions and wages of his union members by seeking greater cooperation and labor peace with a small number of large coal companies while helping these companies pursue greater mechanization, thereby lowering overall employment numbers. But the concessions, compromises, and loss of employment that followed led to the increasing number of wildcat strikes and internal strife within the union. The strikes were also fueled by abuses in the grievance and arbitration procedures. Coal operators made confronting and breaking the wildcat strikes a top priority. The strike was chaotic, with rank and file determined to win back the right to strike. The UMW contracts did not include no strike clauses, but a 1970 U.S. Supreme Court decision barred strike activity for the duration of any contract that included a grievance procedure with binding arbitration. President Carter invoked the national emergency provision of the Taft-Hartley Act. This is a pretty extreme measure. And a federal district court ordered the miners back to work. This was roundly ignored as one West Virginia miner declared, and I quote, "Taft can mine it, Hartley can haul it, and Carter can shove it." But the UMW was in decline. While the union, as recently as 1970, mined 75% of the nation's soft coal, that figure had slipped to 50% by 1977, thanks to increased production from non-unionized Western strip mines. Previous strikes in 1971 and 74 had lasted 45 and 26 days. This strike in 77-78 ended after 110 days, making it the longest in the history of the coal industry. However, in a sign of both the union and industry's declining importance, unlike previous labor actions, there were no serious power curtailments or layoffs in affected industries. Right? So if we were to dial this back, if there had been a coal strike lasting 100 days in 1920 or 1910 or 1900 or even 1930, that would have had massive economic and political repercussions that would have rippled across the country. Did not happen in 1977-78. Even with the UMW in decline, the utility industry did not welcome this return to coal. While recognized as being cheaper than oil or nuclear power, many utility executives noted that they had just spent the last 20 years switching from coal to cleaner burning oil for air pollution reasons. They stressed the technical and financial difficulties in a large-scale conversion. They noted the inadequate rail facilities and barge transfer stations to bring in the coal, that the infrastructure, once available to northeastern utilities in particular, that had burned large quantities of coal had deteriorated by the late 1970s, following a large-scale switch. Utility executives also complained about the cost and ineffectiveness of sulfur dioxide scrubbers. Many utilities in the process of building nuclear power plants were wary of the additional capital costs. And then there was the sweeping nature by which the new Department of Energy, just came into existence in 1977, might order entire categories of oil-burning facilities to switch. The industry magazine Electrical Week described Carter's policy proposals as, quote, perhaps the deepest federal push into utility affairs since the 1935 breakup of holding companies. I can explain that history if that sort of eludes everybody. Surprisingly, the coal industry was also opposed to federally mandatory conversion. Carl Bagg, president of the National Coal Association, testifying before Congress in the spring of 1977, offered three broad reasons for the industry's opposition. First, Bagg argued that the electric utility industry had essentially given up on nuclear power and oil, as most large new baseload generating power plants scheduled for construction would burn coal. And to require these companies to spend capital on retrofitting existing plants that would only be retired in the near future by larger, newer coal-fired plants was a waste of money that would actually slow down the conversion to coal. Second, the most significant constraint on the use of coal, in his mind, was air quality requirements. Less restrictive or, quote, more balanced air quality laws and regulations would be a stronger inducement toward increasing coal consumption. And third, federal price controls on oil and natural gas artificially kept these prices low to the disadvantage of coal. The industry was also afraid that forced conversion would eventually lead to price and allocation controls within the coal industry, or of the coal industry. Despite the opposition of the coal and utility industries and the lukewarm support of environmentalists, coal conversion was simply not a controversial energy policy in the 1970s. The impact of gasoline lines and the increased cost of gasoline were largely blamed in the public imagination on OPEC and OAPEC, and this helped clear away objections to policies that promised to reduce the nation's reliance on foreign oil, and so the policy was supported uniformly by the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations. President Carter described his administration's energy policy in a national televised speech before a joint session of Congress in April of '77, this announcing the results of his 90-day study, right? We're 90 days, we're going to have a new energy policy. His national energy plan consisted of 113 legislative and administrative proposals and one large omnibus energy bill. A part of the bill called for increasing coal consumption from about 700 million tons to 1.1 billion tons by 1985, with most of this new coal being used to generate electricity. The administration calculated that its measures would reduce by 4.5 million barrels the 7 million barrels of oil imported into the U.S. every day. The conversion from oil to coal in the generation of electricity alone was projected to save 1.5 to 2 million barrels of oil per day. The goal of energy independence, first articulated by Richard Nixon, was dropped. And while Carter acknowledged that burning coal does create, quote, environmental difficulties, end quote, he went on to claim that the country could cope with them through strict strip mining and clean air standards. So Carter's omnibus energy bill passed the House in August of '77, was broken up into 5 bills, the 5 bills you see here. Next slide. The policy of converting the nation's electric power plants back to coal found new expression in the Power Plant and Industrial Fuel Use Act of 1978. This act prohibited the use of gas or oil as a primary fuel source for new electric power plants and certain industrial fuel burning institutions. It granted the DOE authority to require existing coal-capable power plants and installations to convert to coal or alternative fuels. The department could order facilities to convert individually or by category if such conversion was technologically and financially feasible. Power plants using natural gas could continue to do so until 1990, after which all plants would be prohibited from using natural gas as a primary energy source. The prohibitions in the act were automatic. The burden of proof to meet a range of exemptions fell to the owner of the facility and not the government. This is heavy medicine. In addition to the financial and technical exemptions, there were important environmental exemptions. Violations of applicable environmental requirements found in federal or state law were grounds for not ordering a conversion. I've talked to people in the natural gas industry who were lobbying on behalf of decontrolling natural gas prices in the 1970s. This is the ship that sailed through the night that they missed, right? getting natural gas prices on a glide path towards deregulation in 81 was a very big victory for the natural gas industry, but was really retrospectively overshadowed by this. Now, this was repealed later in the 80s, but it did considerable damage to the natural gas business. This is premised on natural gas shortages that materialized in the late 60s and existed through the mid-70s, but by the late 70s had largely gone. Next slide. So the record is clear, as this slide demonstrates. The production of coal consumption the production of coal increased by 64% between 1975 and 2000, reaching Carter's goal of 1.1 billion in 1998. And we can see in this figure that after declining in the 50s, coal consumption increased between 1975 and 2000 from 500,000 short tons to over 1 billion, an increase of 92%. We should recognize that the shift back towards coal produced a number of real environmental consequences. First, as noted above, coal production and consumption increased over the remaining decades of the 20th century. By the mid-1980s, 94 electric power plants had converted to coal. Yet despite the reports of various committees and promises made by the Carter administration, the beneficiaries of this recommitment to coal were not going to accept the caveat that it needed to be accompanied by a concern for the environment. In fact, in a speech in Washington in the spring of '79, Governor John D. Rockefeller IV attacked the Carter administration for issuing a series of, quote, unprecedented, illogical, uninformed rules and regulations relating to the mining of coal. The president cannot expect to keep all of his environmental constituency on the one hand and double coal production in the United States on the other, end quote. The momentum and logic of this shift back toward coal emboldened the industry, which successfully lobbied the Congress so as to avoid a ban on strip mining or mountaintop removal in the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of '77. So to the extent that there, for a time, existed a détente between environmentalists and the coal industry and coal entrepreneurs and coal supporters, it was fraying almost as soon as it was arrived at. Next slide. Second, the conversion of coal eroded the nation's air quality. The law encouraged utility companies to seek exemptions from EPA for compliance with the Clean Air Act, and it placed pressure on the agency to grant them. As a result, many Midwestern power plants managed to escape full compliance with the act. Those cities and states on the East Coast downwind from this pollution have been paying the price ever since in the form of acid rain, among other air pollution problems. One recent study found in 2005 air pollution was responsible for 200,000 premature deaths, with 52,000 of those deaths attributed to power generation. In the case of both air pollution and strip mining, the environmentalists were naive to believe that the United States could ramp up coal consumption without suffering a decline in environmental quality. Another form of pollution are the CO2 emissions from coal-fired plants, a problem that barely registered in the 70s. Yet the impact has been real. Over the course of the 70s and 80s, coal began to account for a growing percentage of the nation's greenhouse gas emissions. This has the effect of exposing coal as the proverbial low-hanging fruit when it comes to reducing the CO2 emissions. Right? The Beyond Coal campaign, or the war on coal, is not really a war on coal. It's a war on CO2 emissions, with coal being the most obvious, because of this renaissance, the most obvious and easiest thing to do. The collapse of gas prices, natural gas prices in 2007 and the election of Barack Obama in 2008 inaugurated a steep decline in coal production and consumption that the coal industry has described as a war on coal. A new politics emerged where coal and coal miners are at the center of a populist, conservative, working-class political identity that Donald Trump has mobilized to great effect. What the coal industry had forgotten was the extent to which it was living on borrowed time. The revival of coal in the 70s was partially the product of a large state intervention. Coal was the beneficiary of conditions in the 70s that will not likely be repeated. Rising oil and natural gas prices, coupled with the idea that the world was quickly running out of oil and gas. That doesn't exist any longer. Add to this the collapse of nuclear power and the immaturity of wind, solar, and batteries left coal as the only option. And so an entire generation of electric power plants were built in the 1970s and run on coal, right? And so a generation later, as those plants come up for relicensing or renewal, this is a big reason why you're seeing sort of the opportunity for the switch away. At this moment, oh yeah, okay, I just said that. Okay, well, we could certainly see natural gas prices rise, the rising market share of solar, wind, and batteries, coupled with a flattening in electricity demand and the growing awareness of the costs associated with climate change, make it hard to imagine how coal might once again be called upon to save the nation. But if the coal industry forgot the extent to which it was saved by the troubles of its competing energy sources in the 70s, the environmental community and coal's critics had forgotten the ability of the federal government to remake energy markets. PIFWA, this is short for the Power Plant Industrial Fuel Use Act. No, that's not. Go back to the last one. I'm just running my hands around. PIFWA clearly demonstrated the potential for markets to be shaped and remade by the state. The Trump administration appeared to remind everyone of this fact when it launched two initiatives intended to bring back coal. First, a wide-ranging assault on environmental laws and regulations that go far beyond attacking the changes initiated under the Obama administration. And second, in September of 2017, the Department of Energy requested that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission issue a new rule that would require regional transmission organizations and independent grid operators to establish rate tariffs for generating plants that could secure 90 days of fuel on site. The DOE gave FERC 60 days to issue the rule. The tariff would act as a powerful subsidy, directly benefiting coal, as well as hydro and nuclear power, but it was really designed to support coal. It would completely upend the economics of coal by guaranteeing utilities that use coal a cost of service rate regardless of need or cost to the system. It was justified on the grounds that it would improve grid reliability. This was premised on the notion that the retirement of baseload generating coal plants in favor of natural gas, solar, and wind over the past 10 years had rendered the grid less resilient because it's not always windy or sunny, and natural gas has traditionally been used for peaking and not baseload power. The tariff could conceivably bring back coal. Yet a DOE report on the issue published in the summer of 2017 explicitly failed to recommend new subsidies. In fact, the report found that the energy mix of the electric utility system had changed without sacrificing grid reliability. That report was authored by a Republican appointee who then resigned a couple of months ago, shortly after issuing it. The 5 members of FERC, 4 of whom were appointed by President Trump, rejected the DOE proposed rule this past January. The Commission can only order tariff changes if the existing tariffs are, quote, unjust, unreasonable, unduly discriminatory, or preferential, end quote. The administration had simply failed to develop a record to meet this legal threshold. A concurring opinion doubted that such a record was even possible, given that the existing evidence suggests the threat to grid reliability is in transmission and distribution, which is the largest source of blackouts, and not in the generating mix. I'd suggest this proposed rule was a modern version of the Power Plant and Industrial Fuel Use Act of 1978, but without the hearings, debate, or public participation. It's an attempt to use regulatory agencies to achieve policy that would not pass the Congress, an increasingly common tactic on both the left and the right in our modern political landscape. But it's worth asking the question, why did the Trump administration avoid using Congress? Republicans enjoy a considerable majority in the House of Representatives, potential support from Senate Democrats that hail from coal-producing states, and a president who campaigned to bring back coal. Could the political fortunes of coal look any better than they do right now? And yet, no one expects the Congress to do anything to help coal. Why? I think the answer lies in the fact that coal is a true political orphan. It does not have a home. The environmental consequences of burning coal and the flipping of coal-producing states from blue to red mean that coal has little support within the Democratic Party. That's clear. And the Republican Party is far too beholden to the oil and gas industry to ever allow coal a competitive advantage over natural gas. And that's just a fact that has to be recognized. The situation is only exacerbated by the ineffectiveness with which the coal industry itself has advanced its own cause. And to illustrate this point, I want to tell you a little story about what natural gas producers are willing to do to defend their business. 10 years ago, Chesapeake Energy Company, headquartered in Oklahoma City, was the largest natural gas producer in the US. Today, it trails only ExxonMobil. In 2007, natural gas prices collapsed, suddenly making the company considerably less profitable. Aubrey McClendon, then the Chesapeake CEO, determined that the best way to raise prices would be to expand consumption. And one means of doing that would be to displace coal. And so McClendon and his associates became one of the earliest sources of funding for the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign, contributing $25 million between 2007 and 2010. The club turned down an additional $30 million when it decided to end the relationship in 2010. So yes, low natural gas prices were an important factor in utility companies deciding to turn from coal to natural gas over the last 10 years, but don't overlook the fact that the natural gas industry used environmentalists to help pay for the lawyers and economists to make that argument before dozens of state regulatory agencies as the licenses for coal-powered plants came up for renewal over the last 10 years. The collapse in natural gas prices was made possible by fracking. At the same time that Beyond Coal campaign was launching into high gear, there also existed an anti-fracking campaign. This movement actually succeeded in seeing the states of New York, Vermont, and Maryland ban fracking. But it has largely petered out. And so one might ask, where was the coal money funding the anti-fracking campaign? All of which is to say, it's hard to win when you bring a knife to a gunfight. It's also hard to win by advancing the magical thinking that if only a sufficient number of environmental laws and regulations could be rolled back, then the good times will return, right? All of these environmental laws and regulations being rolled back on the coal industry in the first year and a half of the Trump administration are also being rolled back on the natural gas industry. So the economic competitive advantage that might result from that is going to be significantly dampened. So what the above history reveals is that coal can return if the nation, acting through the state, decides it wants it to return. The sources of energy we use are ultimately a choice. All forms of energy are intentionally and unintentionally subsidized and damaged by state and federal policies. Congress could create subsidies or grant to the executive branch the authority to order conversions to coal. States can also offer subsidies, as New York has done for nuclear power through a clean energy program. I don't know if you've heard of this, but a bunch of nuclear power plants in the state of New York are losing money. They were threatening to close. The state says, well, they're too important to the energy mix. They provide clean power. We're going to subsidize them. Absent these measures, I have a hard time imagining a future where coal is not in long-term decline. So on that unhappy note, that's it. Thank you. Am I supposed to take questions or just get off the stage? Do people have questions? Okay.
I've got one. From a standpoint of the war on coal, right now we can ship coal to Asian markets, but we're being blocked. We're being blocked by Washington State, allowing our commodity to be shipped overseas. What can be done to rectify that?
Well, I mean, the short answer is I'm not a lawyer, right? So I don't know, right? I don't know like what one state could do to another state to get them to allow the infrastructure to be built to allow for the exporting of coal. But look at the bigger picture. Why is Washington blocking the exporting of coal? It's the same reason that people in those in those areas that burn coal don't want coal burned or wouldn't mind seeing a conversion away from coal. It's because of the pollution in the greenhouse gases, right? So, it's the liability, the environmental liability, that creates the conditions for the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign is the same liability that explains kind of Washington State's objection. But I mean, the short answer is I don't have the legal expertise to tell you what grounds Washington stands on, what Montana might be able to do. But I mean, yes, there's going to be in the coal industry of the last year has rebounded a little bit because of the export market, and so to some extent, I think there's probably some sentiment within the industry that that's a future, right, or at least part of the present if it's going to do okay, but. You also have to ask yourself before investing in all of the infrastructure for how long, because just as the United States is beginning to convert, all these other countries are too. Yeah.
When we went through that conversion process, I remember the big argument that at least I thought was convincing was that natural gas is really easy to transport. It's easy to get into local homes. We ought to save our natural gas for heating because without it, we'd have a real huge problem. You haven't mentioned that. Was that a factor? And what about the future?
I mean, the bigger factor was that utility companies ran into problems acquiring natural gas, right? They had problems getting long-term contracts for natural gas. And so because natural gas prices were controlled by the Federal Power Commission, there wasn't a price mechanism that I guess gave consumers an honest assessment, or let alone a futures market, as to what to expect down the road. And so there was a growing kind of pessimism in the 1970s that the country just had a limited amount of natural gas and we were running out. The industry itself would say, well, that's because prices are controlled. And once you get rid of price controls, then natural gas prices would spike up, and supply and demand, the market would take care of it. And that's kind of what happened on some level.
So what about the future? Was that an argument?
The future for natural gas, no, because fracking has made available enormous supplies of natural gas, like, generational supplies of natural gas. We're not going to run out of natural gas in this country for a very long time. In fact, they're building export terminals in Texas as we speak, and signing long-term contracts to send it out to Asia. I mean, there's going to be, natural gas prices are so low that it's not uncommon for companies that come across a natural gas find just to cap it, not even produce it, just leave it in the ground and wait. I don't know how accurate this is, but I think I read somewhere recently Pennsylvania might have more natural gas alone than Saudi Arabia. I mean, the amount of natural gas that's been discovered. I mean, this is why prices crashed. Crashed. In my state, Oklahoma, suffered from that price crash because a lot of our state budget comes from production taxes used to come from production taxes on natural gas, not anymore. But the size of the supply that's been discovered is just, is what's really driven a lot of these changes. It's enormous.
Would you repeat the points you made on this recent Department of Energy study about, kind of an aha about grid reliability or consistency, and then remark on, is this well understood and agreed to by all stakeholders? The conclusions of that.
Yeah, I think everyone, I think it was widely believed that grid reliability was an excuse to create a subsidy for coal, right? That we haven't experienced decreased grid reliability as a result of seeing greater natural gas use, as a result of seeing alternatives play a larger role in the energy mix. And so I think it was, and then I think it was recognized as basically just being a kind of a fig leaf. And the DOE under Rick Perry released a study that was supposed to accompany the rule, the proposed rule, that didn't support the proposed rule. And that's because the economists who are working on it have the intellectual integrity to say, the data just isn't there. And the FERC administrators, despite the fact, look, I think if there was a way in which they could have subsidized coal, they probably would have. But they couldn't do so in a way that was consistent with the data. And there's going to be, if there had been a rule, there would have been judicial review, and so the judiciary would have looked over that as well. But it just wasn't in the cards. And the problem for that argument going forward is the declining cost of battery storage. So, in 2012, the EIA predicted that, at the time, battery storage was at like $500 a megawatt hour. It predicted 2040, battery storage would be at $250 a megawatt hour. It hit $250 a megawatt hour last year. Right? Elon Musk just built one of the largest factories in the world in the desert outside of Reno, Nevada. And what are they doing there? They're building batteries. They're building batteries for Tesla cars. That might be a more successful battery company than it is a car company. Right? Because they're scaling that up at a level that is unprecedented. And the costs are going down. So when you add batteries to the mix, it's hard to see, it's hard to make that reliability argument. The evidence for it just isn't there.
Would you care to comment, please, on a recent federal district court decision here in Montana that would require that global climate change be acknowledged and dealt with in NEPA actions, National Environmental Policy Act actions in the future, EISs and the like?
Yeah. Well, EIS statements are great, but they're not binding, right? So what the EIS requirement of NEPA, and I know a little bit about this because my first book is somewhat about this, require that anytime a company does something that requires a federal license or approval of some sort, they have to do a study to figure out what the environmental implications or impacts are going to be. And so adding in climate change among the other, thinking about the other potential environmental impacts is, gives the government more information as to whether or not it wants to approve a project or not, and it gives other stakeholders and members of the community more information, but it's not, NEPA itself is not action forcing. It's just information, right? So will learning more about the climate change implications of a particular action change whether or not that change to the environment, that action takes place? Who knows? Any other questions? All right, thank you.